listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to astrobiologist Professor Lewis Dartnell.
I think it's undeniable that in the coming decades and centuries, we will spread as a species beyond our cradle, beyond the Earth. We will be building first temporary and then hopefully permanent bases and habitation on the Moon, on Mars. We'll probably be mining asteroids and comets for useful materials, whether that's metals or organics or water that we need to bootstrap us as a sort of interplanetary species.
Lewis shared his insights into how biology has shaped civilization, the challenges of living on Mars, and why cooperation is our human superpower. This podcast started as a way to explore and interrogate what it means to be human in the 21st century. To that end, many of our episodes have focused on the multitude of possible technological extensions of our species. But every so often, I'm lucky enough to have a guest like Lewis Dartnell, who has a deep understanding of how humanity got to where it is today and how this trajectory has been shaped by its long history. From the impact of geography and geology on the origins of civilization to the intimate interconnections between genetics and societal norms. The latter is the focus of Lewis's most recent book, Being Human, a celebration of the unique traits and capabilities that have helped our species thrive. It is full of surprising and counterintuitive stories, including how climate change, plagues, pandemics, and other key historical events are responsible for so much of what we take for granted in the modern world. But true to form, I couldn't resist asking Lewis about the future. He is an astrobiologist by training, and later in this episode we explore the biological adaptations we might need to propagate the stars and to live on other planets like Mars. I first encountered Lewis's work through his fascinating book, The Knowledge, a guide for how to reboot civilization after an apocalypse. It's a must-read, especially in our trying times. What was clear from this early work is that Lewis is an expert science communicator, and as you'll see from this episode, he has the rare talent of being able to match his expansive knowledge with extreme eloquence. It's why it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Lewis Dartnell to the Futures Podcast. So, Lewis, you literally wrote the book on being human. And the question of what it means to be human in the 21st century is at the core of this podcast. So I guess my first question is, how does our humanness express itself? What is it that makes us unique?
Yeah, so this is what I've tried to look at with a new book called Appropriately Being Human. And it works its way back through history to look at all the ways that different features of us as a species have been deeply influential through human history and the making of the modern world, as you say. So that's aspects of our genetics or our physiology or anatomy or our psychology and cognitive biases. And of course, all of that lies behind the world we live in today. You know, it is our bodies and our capabilities and our psychology which has created the world that we live in. You know, we live in a very artificial world nowadays. It is a product of our own culture as much as anything natural to do with the Earth. But I wanted to sort of peel back that veneer of the obvious, if you like, and look at the surprising ways that intrinsic features of our humanness have been important and explore some of those stories which hopefully will be much more surprising and new to the audience.
So what would you say is our human superpower?
Yeah, so there's been many books in the past that try to single out and identify what it is that makes us so special. You know, if we assume that humans are special in the first place, and you know, an elephant with its exquisite trunk would disagree that it has supreme trunkiness compared to us. But in terms of our general levels of intelligence and capabilities in terms of not just tool use, but tool creation and tool design, and perhaps even more than that, what stands out for humanity is our exquisite ability to work together and cooperate and collaborate in these huge joint ventures in the way that civilization itself you could describe as being the sort of greatest example of the top level example of human cooperation, of not just a few dozen people collaborating on maybe a hunt in the grasslands, but thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, and now millions of people all living in incredibly dense populations in cities and getting on largely peacefully with each other and all pulling in the same direction, all performing a particular role within society. You know, the sum is much greater. The whole is much greater than the sum of its parts. And that, I would say, has been the key standout of capability for humanity that's helped us build this modern world that we live in.
So why do you think it is that we were optimized for this form of cooperation?
Well, there's a lot of research that's gone into this. There's books such as Nicola Rahani's Social Instinct that's looked at that question in particular. What is it that makes humans so cooperative, so good at working together? I'd recommend her book. I've used it in the first chapter of Being Human when I'm addressing that particular subset of all that makes us human. But cooperating together allows individuals to achieve things which they would not have been able to do otherwise, such as a pack of wolves cooperating together to pull down a large game animal that no one wolf could have pulled down itself. And similarly with humans on the hunt, and far more than just hunting and the way that we find food to feed ourselves. With the invention of agriculture and civilization, we also pull together in sort of manipulating and shaping the environment around us, digging irrigation canals to water the fields so we can get more crop to eat out of any acre of land. So there's many, many different examples through history of how humans express that exquisite helpfulness or cooperation with each other.
Well, that seems to fly contrary to this idea that human beings, they're competitive. I guess that's best captured in the phrase, the survival of the fittest. So are there some myths about the long history of humanity that we need to dispel?
Well, I mean, you can generate false dichotomies, right? So by saying that humans are cooperative or exhibit a lot of cooperation in their behavior, that's not to say that we're never malicious or downright mean or selfish or aggressive to each other. Human behavior is incredibly complex and sophisticated, and in different times and different circumstances and to different individuals, we can be cooperative or we can be aggressive. And it's a very rich melting pot. But certainly what needed to happen in our own evolution to allow us to live in larger and larger, more and more dense populations, and then eventually giving rise to civilizations and incredibly populous cities, was a reduction in human aggression or aggression between individuals compared to what we see in our closest primate relatives. So chimpanzees are pretty aggressive to each other. And even bonobos, which everyone hold up as being the paragon of peaceful coexistence, are far more aggressive to each other when you study them and actually look at the stats than human societies. So it's kind of part of our software, if you want to describe it that way, that has been one of the prerequisites for going on to develop civilization and the building of the modern world.
Well, I noticed that when reading your book, you use this idea of software and hardware as metaphors to think about the human. So why are those metaphors useful?
Well, I think any metaphor is only useful until it stops being useful, if you see what I mean. You can, as a writer, you try to use metaphors to help explain complex topics to someone who is not a specialist. But you always want to avoid the risk of oversimplifying something or pushing the metaphor too far so it no longer becomes helpful. But I think at least on a first level, describing sort of human hardware, so aspects of our physicality, of our body and what our bodies are capable of, as composed to our software in terms of our psychology and our cognition, I think on the face of it is a relatively useful distinction to make, whilst also, of course, acknowledging immediately that our psychology and our cognition is a product of our physicality and sort of neuronal network of connections and synapses in our brain. I think by using the sort of technological language in that way, it does highlight things in a way that is meaningful and helps with explanations and descriptions.
But you don't mean that the human is some form of machine, do you?
Well, I mean, I suppose you could say in a literal sense, we are like a machine. We are an organic robot. And Richard Dawkins has used very similar language in the past to describe ourselves as organic robots created by genes to propagate genes. And there's a lot of mileage in those kind of metaphors and that kind of perspective. But on the other hand, again, I wouldn't ever begin to claim that we are a slave to our programming in the way that a robot or a computer system might be. I'm not denying free will. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and reject that there's any influence of our evolutionary history or our biological physicality or psychology in human history and the making of the modern world, whilst also denying that it is the only influence or the only force.
Well, we might not be a slave to our programming, but as you suggest in the book, we are profoundly shaped by our biology. So how has our biology shaped the way we navigate the world?
Yeah, so there's different chapters in the book, and each chapter looks at different parts of what makes us human. And through every chapter of the book, I try to draw this long line of cause and effect from something deep and intrinsic about us and how we evolved and why we evolved that way, and then trace the long chain of sort of cause and effect of consequences through history. And one of the major evolutionary developments in our lineage was the development of the human family. So as humans became simultaneously big-brained and also bipedal, we became more intelligent and we started walking upright on two legs. Those two adaptations are at loggerheads with each other, that they're mutually exclusive, because the skull of the baby has to pass through the birth canal, has to pass through a hole in the pelvis, and trying to have big-brained babies whilst also having the pelvis that's being remodeled by evolution so you can walk upright are in direct conflict with each other. And so the solution that evolution hit upon in human evolution was to greatly extend the developmental process beyond being born. So we have long periods of infancy when we're incredibly reliant on a mother to raise us, to feed us, to protect us, to the extent where in human evolution, the mother alone could no longer rear a child successfully. In contrast to many other species of animals, the father was also required to help successfully rear children. So humans developed biparental investment in child rearing. And that requires a kind of sort of evolutionary contract, if you like, to bind mother and father together through those vulnerable years of their child's infancy. And this is a hormonal mediated pair bond mediated by oxytocin. And then we experience that as a romantic love. And this bond between mother and child, and now also father and child, and also importantly between mother and father, forms the nucleus of the human family. That is something that is intrinsic to us as a species. It's something that is quirky about us compared to many other animal species. And those have had huge consequences through history, with the passing of power down families, with the origin of monarchy and hugely powerful ruling families and dynasties throughout history. All of that comes down to biological facts to do with kin selection or the human family and the sort of developmental process that we grew out of.
So in other words, you're suggesting that our societal norms, they're informed by our biology?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we look at other key aspects of societies, and particularly large societies and civilizations, we've had to repeatedly develop systems of law codes, like rules that we write down so that everyone knows what is an acceptable thing to do in society and is not an acceptable thing to do in society. And they are governed and administered by a king or specially empowered people that the king gives authority to. And in the modern world, we have, police forces and courts and prisons to catch people who do wrong and punish people who do wrong to try to prevent other people from doing it. And all of that system of code of laws comes from a foundation of human morality, what we already understand, almost intrinsically understand to be good behavior, moral behavior, or bad behavior, amoral behavior. And a lot of that just comes down to, as we were saying earlier, the software that we needed, the psychological software we needed in order to be able to coexist peacefully and cooperate in large groups. Again, trace that chain of cause and effect from how we lived in this sort of ancestral condition through greater and greater populations as we progressed through society and civilization to the codes of laws that we invented to formalize what we kind of know inherently anyway.
Well, it feels like those codes of laws, they were developed to deal with our biological limits. But what happens when we use things like technology to start transcending those limits? How does that have a feedback loop on the way in which society is structured?
Yeah, so we've been using technology to firstly enhance our native capabilities, our native natural abilities, but also to sort of make up or mask our weaknesses. And we can do both with technology. And going right back thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, when things like the millstone were invented to grind grain. So wild grass species that we gathered down to wheat and barley and bran and other cereal crops that we cultivated, we grind those into flour and then bake them in an oven to make bread and release nutrients inside them. And when you think about it in broad terms, that millstone, that very sort of heart of everything that we've done with agriculture since, is effectively just a pair of teeth. We've invented mechanical teeth that grind up food for us so we don't have to chew. We don't have to invest energy in our mouths to chew. And the pot we use to boil vegetables or rice in, or the oven we use for baking bread, is for all intents and purposes an external pre-digestive system. We've invented a stomach out of our bodies to help break down that nutrition so that we can then absorb it much more readily in our bodies. And without using things like fire, we never would have been able to attain the levels of intelligence we have by simply just getting enough energy from our diets to fuel such a energy demanding computer that the human brain is. So right back to the very beginnings of what it is to be human, we've been using technology to enhance ourselves through, some medieval ages of inventing spectacles to make up for weaknesses in our sight. And there's a lot of talk nowadays about how technology will change us in the future, how we'll harness technology and how it will change us in return, from AI or implanting microchips in our brain to enhance our memory or be able to, give us capabilities that we hadn't had otherwise. And in a sense, I think that's inevitable. Whenever new technology comes along, we as a society decide how we want to adopt that to help us. And on the whole, we've made good decisions, but also we've made bad decisions along the way. And I don't see that changing as you go into the future.
Well, despite those technological feats, there's this common parlance, this common idea that we're physiologically and psychologically the same as our ancestors. So does that have any advantages, or is it mainly just a disadvantage that we're so similar in terms of our biology to our ancestors?
Well, yes and no, to be honest. It's both. And there's a big area of ongoing research, again, that looks at evolutionary mismatches.
Yeah.
So ways that the modern world we live in today is importantly different from the ancestral condition, the ancestral environment which we evolved in Africa, perhaps specifically East Africa and the grasslands. And the modern world, which, as we've already said, is a very artificial place that we've created through our own cultural inheritance. We have built the world that we now live in. And so there's a huge disjoint between the world that our bodies and our genetics and our psychology adapted to and the world we now find ourselves in. And this has been used to explain a whole suite of sort of modern diseases, such as high incidence of diabetes, heart disease, and things like that, because we're eating the sort of diets that are not healthy in the modern world. We have so much easy access to very high sugar, high fat, high salt, which would have been high value items on the grasslands when they're hard to come by. But now you can pop down the high street for a couple of quid and fill your belly with incredibly nutritious food, end up getting fat and unhealthy. So there are negative consequences of that evolutionary history and how we've sort of overtaken it. So definitely there are those sort of negative aspects, yeah.
Well, in the early 2000s, there used to be all these reports about this idea that human beings, because of mobile phones, would evolve extra ambidextrous thumbs so that we could text. I think they were being facetious to a degree, but this idea that culture can actually change our biology, are we seeing any examples of that in our modern life?
Well, some very solid examples of exactly that in our early history. When we started working out how to domesticate wild animals to become our livestock and cultivating wild plants to become our crops. And across large areas of Africa and then also Europe and other parts around the world, we domesticated mammals and started milking them. And we are mammals ourselves. So we spend the first couple of months, if not years, being fed by our mother when she lactates. We drink milk. But in all other mammals, when they progress out of infancy, they stop drinking milk. Apart from humans who literally suckle on the teat of other animals. And we feed ourselves through to adulthood in many cultures around the world on milk. And, I have milk in my tea, which is this weird mishmash of an incredibly ancient technology with something much more recent that's an addictive substance that we cultivate in China and now around the world that has caffeine, which fires up particular parts of our brain. So we find it addictive. So there's a whole chapter in Being Human about addictive substances which have become incredibly deeply ingrained in our cultures. But that dairying and domesticating animals and drinking their milk has had a huge influence on the subsequent development of humanity and the expression of different genes. So cultures which have historically dairied and drunken milk continue to express the lactase gene that creates the enzyme to break down milk. Whereas if you look at populations in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where they haven't historically dairied, if you give them a few droplets of milk, it makes them violently ill as an adult. So there's some very good ancient examples of that deep interplay between our culture and our genetics and things which are intrinsic to us, feeding back and forth in a virtuous cycle.
This might seem like a segue, but where does lactose intolerance come from in the modern age? It seems like everybody has an issue with milk currently.
Yeah, so that there are some populations, some groups of humans who are sort of inherently lactose intolerant, that they do not express the lactase enzyme into their adulthood because they didn't adapt their genes in order to do so, because they haven't for thousands of years been drinking milk. But what we also find, and what is reported at least, is that people who have been drinking milk quite happily throughout their life suddenly, or perhaps more slowly, develop lactose intolerance and no longer find it comfortable to eat or drink lots of milk. It's not something I know much about. That's not one thing I researched too deeply into when I was researching this book. But, there are shifts in our gene expression and our digestion throughout life. It's perhaps not a surprising thing to find.
Well, one thing you do cover in the book is the rise of civilization and how civilization has been so intimately informed by biology. So do you think progress was always inevitable, or was it guided in some part by our human limits and expression as biological beings?
Yeah, I stay well clear of implications of inevitability. And with Being Human and with my previous book, Origins, which looks at how features of the planet have directed the course of the human story, from plate tectonics to the circulation of the atmosphere to where different natural resources are found, I'm very careful to stay clear of geographical determinism and staying clear similarly from biological determinism in this latest book in Being Human. But as I was saying earlier, by acknowledging that, of course, there have been important influences from the natural environment we live in and intrinsic aspects of us as a species, you can acknowledge that those have been important without trying to claim they've been all dominant or nothing else has had influence as well. There's a happy middle ground that you can explore as a scientist, as an historian, as a writer, between those two extremes.
Well, I was going to ask you if you were a biological determinist.
because preempted that one.
You preempted that one to some degree. But the reason I ask is why is that such a contested idea?
Well, I think it's controversial for good reasons. People have in the past used things like biological determinism or geographical determinism to argue that their state has claim over another's territory because of natural order of things. And it's quite often when science gets twisted and distorted and abused to serve other agendas. So within Nazi Germany, for example, claims were put over other territories because it was the natural German states, natural to extend into. So there's historical reasons why such arguments on determinism have been rightfully roundly rejected, but also scientific reasons why they're in fact meaningless in the first place. And within biology, as I've kind of said already, you can acknowledge that certain aspects of our genetics have been important, but only within the context and the environment you grow up in. And then on top of that, we still have free will, that, no one is born a killer. You have agency over your life and you can choose to do a good thing or a bad thing. We are not robots being controlled by ironclad programming.
What was it? We're biological or organic robots with affordances. We're not controlled,
exactly,
but we have certain affordances. But I do think there's something interesting in exploring the myths of biological determinism, because when we create these grand narratives about how human biology is responsible for the way in which we navigate life today, we fall into all of these traps, don't we? There's so many traps that we can get caught in. And so how do we avoid getting caught in those biological determinist traps?
Well, I think with everything, it needs to be an ongoing and honest discussion between scientists discovering aspects of us as a species and historians and philosophers and ethicists who know about other areas of knowledge about what has happened in the past and what were the drivers for that and how have particular things been avoided. And it needs to be a free-flowing conversation back and forth with both of those or all of those areas of knowledge and understanding informing each other. And as we've been saying already, when knowledge like that starts to being distorted to push particular agendas or perhaps, for example, nationalistic agendas, it should fall and does fall upon scientists and historians and academia in general to correct the politicians who are trying to, present a one-sided view to support their own policy or support their agenda. And we have been seeing a lot of that with modern politics here in Britain and in the US, of course, but across Europe and the rest of the world as well. It's the free public debate which keeps things honest and keeps things on an even keel.
Well, as you suggested at the beginning, there's examples throughout the book of these interesting ways in which society or biology has shaped us. And one of those surprising ways is how plagues and pandemics have shaped society. So could you tell me a little bit more about the unintended consequences of plagues and pandemics?
Yeah, so clearly we've had a pandemic, a global pandemic very recently. And what pundits were predicting at the time, to a large extent, does seem to have happened. There has been a shift in our culture and our expectations around work-life balance and how necessary it really is to be going into an office 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And we have seen perhaps just a small shift towards a greater acceptance of working from home and not needing to commute. And as we were saying earlier, technology is enabling all of that, like the technology that you and I are looking at each other at the moment and recording this conversation. So there has been a shift, perhaps even just a small shift in the first couple of years that we've been able to look back on from the coronavirus pandemic. But more severe and more impactful epidemics and pandemics in world history have had, in retrospect, greater shifts in the course of subsequent history. And one of the examples I talk about in Being Human is the Black Death, is the bubonic plague that spread across Europe and across Asia as well, and killed huge fractions of populations in some of the major cities and across the countryside as well, and shifted fundamentally the labour market. Because if a lot of people have died, the people left behind, the people that survived, are more valuable in the labour they can provide to not just really employers from this period in history, but basically lords of the manor in the feudal system. And this is evident in the stats and economic research from the Black Death, but also other big demographic shocks from pandemics and from diseases. And the argument's been made that one of the consequences of the Black Death, in Britain at least, is that it helped to loosen those bonds and ties of the feudal system and made the labour market a bit more diverse, a bit more mobile, and therefore shifted society in quite a fundamental way. It didn't happen immediately. It started the historical wheels from turning, but it's one of these examples that historians discuss as a consequence of disease. There's another story in Being Human about how it was a tropical disease on the other side of the world that helped contribute to the political union of England and Scotland in the early 1700s. And this was tropical diseases like malaria and yellow fever in the Isthmus of Panama, so in Central America, which is quite a bizarre thing to think about. How on earth could tropical disease on the other side of the world have such a political influence? And the story here goes back to Scotland at the time was trying to get involved in its own sort of colonial enterprise and mercantilism, so trading around the world. And they set up what's known as the Darien scheme. They tried to set up a trading colony on the Panama Isthmus, this thin sinew of land between North and South America. and ends up failing, largely because, but although not solely because of tropical diseases in this mosquito buzzing, tropical disease laden part of the world. And so much money had been sunk into that financial venture that Scotland became financially, economically, and politically weakened. And England was able to sort of force its hand in the end to sign up to this political union, which had been thus far able to resist. So again, of course, there isn't a direct or necessary link from tropical disease to that political union, but it has undeniably been a large factor in that, which, not many people heard about. So it's one of the stories I tell about being human, of this link from something biological, something innate about ourselves, to these world-shifting events and processes and trends of human history.
Well, do you think in a decade, when you're writing your 15th book, for example, do you think we'll discover some unintended consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic?
It's a good question. I don't know. It's one of those things that, as you said, may only become apparent in retrospect when you're looking back with 2020 hindsight. There was talk at the time about how it would lead to a permanent shift in people working from home, and we are seeing that. But the question remains as to what extent it will continue for. But it's also going to have some really interesting cultural effects on inner cities in the central business districts and places like the City in London and down in the Docklands, where some exceedingly expensive real estate was created with high-rise buildings, which companies kind of don't want or need anymore. If you've only got, let's say, 40% of your workforce coming at any one time, you need less than half of the office space you had previously, which means half the skyscrapers aren't needed. So in places like Manhattan and London and many other big financial cities around the world, I do wonder what shift we'll see when it's not corporations wanting those skyscrapers, how that land use will shift. Does it go to more so community use? We're going to see more cafes popping up, but also more social spaces in what would have been very private, exclusive land and buildings.
That's interesting. I mean, it's so fascinating in the book how you break down all of these systems we take for granted and show how biology doesn't always match with that system. One example, I guess, is monarchy. I mean, you show how biology can make monarchy something that's, to a degree, obsolete.
Yeah, we touched upon this story in the book a bit earlier about how our biological fundamentals of how we rear children gave rise to human family, which then gave rise to the transference of power within families. So the idea of transference of rulership and monarchy, and how many of the monarchies and ruling families around Europe and wider around the world use those sort of biological aspects of marriage and rearing children to unify two dynasties. They became tools of statecraft, to the extent that the Habsburgs, which is undeniably one of the most influential families in world history, one of the most powerful dynasties through hundreds of years of European history, suffered effectively a particularly potent biological blowback from them playing this Game of Thrones, of using their biology and what were ultimately consanguineous marriages between related royal families, ended up eroding their own genetics, such that Charles II of Spain seemed to have been congenitally unable to have a child, and therefore the entire dynasty collapsed. And it effectively bred itself into extinction, and led to a huge war of Spanish succession as a consequence of that interplay between culture and society and powerful families and the biological basis behind that. So there's that whole story in one of the chapters of the book.
So is the alternative having multiple wives and diversifying? I know that you...
Well, it's interesting because polygamy is a very, very common lifestyle amongst many cultures around the world. I discuss how the balance between polygamy and single pairings between husband and wife traditionally for child rearing has shifted and changed through history and between different cultures. But around the time of Henry VIII, the whole story about the 6 wives was effectively Henry VIII was feeling biologically constrained. He was so acutely aware that he had to not only have one heir for the dynasty, for the monarchy, for the kingdom, he had to have an heir and a spare. So he was looking for 2 sons ideally, and his wives basically weren't delivering. From his point of view, he was not biologically able to achieve that and was culturally prohibited from having several wives at the same time. Unlike his contemporaries in the Ottoman Empire, were able to have multiple wives at the same time in their harem. Henry VIII was not able to, so effectively was forced into serial monogamy, or a kind of temporal version of polygamy, by having one wife after the other until he achieved what he felt he needed. And of the polygynous cultures around the world, they never encounter that problem. You have a powerful man with several wives, and that problem of generating an heir is just not an issue. And that anxiety, that all-consuming anxiety for the monarchy of generating an heir, has been a huge defining feature of the monarchies and dynasties of Europe, but not for other cultures in China, in India, in the Ottoman Empire of the Near East, as I was saying earlier. And that sort of cultural difference based on biological responses, I found was absolutely fascinating as well.
So should someone like Elon Musk have multiple wives?
So actually, I calculate in the book how many wives Elon Musk, with his stated personal wealth, could support in principle. And historically, harems were several hundred. And you have to take some of these reports with a pinch of salt, because having a large harem was a peacock's tail. It was a sign of your power and your prestige in the first instance. So reports of hundreds of wives or consorts in a harem are probably reliable. Thousands of them, maybe less so. And I can't remember the number I calculated, but it was hundreds of thousands of wives Elon Musk could support financially, with a minimum wage, if you like, with his personal wealth. And I know that is a hugely problematic thing to say for many respects. But the point I was getting at is that the wealth disparity today is utterly astonishing, utterly astounding, compared to between, the sovereign and the peasants of previous cultures, previous societies.
Yeah, when Elon says he wants to propagate the stars, no one thought it was going to be with his own spawn.
Yes. Curiously, many of his children are his biologically, but not through copulation, I understand. I think he's having a lot of children through IVF. And I probably should dig down to this a bit more deeply, because it's an interesting angle. But it's the idea of having lots of children to sort of spread your genetic material, but doing it with the latest technological means for doing so is a sort of interesting thing that he is exploring, weird thing he's exploring.
Well, he is interested in space, and of course you are interested in space too as an astrobiologist. And I just wonder, how can we take an astrobiological approach to thinking about humanity?
Yeah, so if I broaden from astrobiology beyond looking for signs of life on other planets. So I spend most of my time thinking about our next door neighbor planet Mars, and whether there could be hardy bacterial life forms on Mars, and how we would detect what would be the best way to search for signs of life. But if we sort of extend beyond that slightly to look into that relationship between humanity and the cosmos, and what is likely to be happening in the future as a species of explorers, where we have hopped from one island to the next, always looking over the horizon to what lies beyond, I think it's undeniable in the coming decades and centuries, we will spread as a species beyond our cradle, beyond the Earth. We will be building first temporary and then hopefully permanent bases and habitation on the Moon, on Mars. We'll probably be mining asteroids and comets for useful materials, whether that's metals or organics or water that we need to bootstrap us as a sort of interplanetary species. All of that at the moment is the mainstay of sci-fi, which I loved reading as a child. But I think we are sort of now on the brink of being able to take those first tentative steps into pulling off. And there's a lot of our biology that we would need to be aware of and try to solve the problems for in keeping humans alive on Mars. And looking back to the absolute fundamentals, for example, we know that successfully having an embryo developing in the womb successfully for 9 months and then being born as a healthy child is possible in 1g of gravity, because we've done that through our existence as a species on the Earth. It seems, for many good reasons, to be impossible to successfully develop an embryo and fetus in a womb in 0 gravity, floating around in weightlessness in a space station. But what we don't know is whether 1/3 of gravity on Mars is sufficient. That there appears to be some kind of threshold between 0 and 1, that gravitational signal is required for healthy human development in the womb. We haven't the foggiest where that lies between 0 and 1g. And that's kind of important if we're trying to have a self-sustaining population on Mars, where there are literally Martians being born. People who are spending their lives on Mars, falling in love, boy meets girl, boy falls in love with girl, boy and girl have a baby together. That would only be possible to have a self-sustaining Martian population of humans if that threshold is somewhere below 0.3g. because otherwise you're now talking about really weird stuff about putting women into a centrifuge to artificially create effectively higher gravity levels for 9 months as they develop, as that fetus develops. I know it's bizarre stuff. Might be necessary if we start having permanent populations on Mars.
I'm sensing the next book, and it feels like this might be the one you write. Although we did have Christopher Mason on the show recently, who was utterly fascinating about the sorts of things that we would need to do to the human body to allow us to survive in 30% gravity on Mars, for example. Do you think ultimately we will be biologically changed by our extraterrestrial environments, or do you think we'll have to change ourselves for those environments?
So again, I think it'll be a bit of both. And if we're talking about self-sustaining populations of humanity on Mars, for example, native Martians, people who have been born there, if that is possible, as we were just discussing, and develop in a lower gravity, they will develop permanently a fundamentally different body structure to terrestrial humans. And they will probably be taller. They'll probably be sort of quite lanky and spindly even, because they don't need to be quite so stout and stocky to support their own weight against gravity. So you will see permanent changes. And then perhaps, again, this sort of weird cultural response that if someone is a native Martian, they might find it very difficult, if not even impossible, to ever come back to their ancestral home of the Earth, because they'll effectively be gravitational sort of outcasts, if you like. Their bodies would not be able to tolerate the much greater gravity on the Earth. They wouldn't be able to visit, even short term, unless we now start talking about weird things like, sort of exoskeletons to help support them. So when we're talking about these sort of sci-fi futures, a lot of weird stuff that would be very alien to us in our 2023 society would find very, very strange. But there's a really nice book that's just about to come out by Zach and Kelly Wienersmith called A City on Mars that looks exactly this. It's incredibly well researched, and it's basically doing bullshit detection on what all the sort of tech bros, Elon Musk and others have been spouting in their own kind of PR releases about how quickly we'll be going to Mars and how we'll be able to achieve it technologically. Because for many good reasons, they describe in the book, and I've been touching upon in my own research, it's going to be a lot harder to do properly and safely than I think many people in that community, that sort of extraterrestrial colonialist optimist community, if we were to dub it that, have really been sort of taking on board. And so it's a great book that looks at some of those questions about the biology of keeping humans alive when our bodies are adapted to an Earth-like environment, how well could it adapt, and what might be the negative consequences of it adapting to extraterrestrial environments, like the lower gravity on Mars, for example, and therefore what sort of technology would we need to enable that habitation.
Well, there's a wonderful film, I think it's The Space Between Us, which covers some of that. A child is born on Mars and can't deal with Earth. To the Martian, Earth is the extraterrestrial environment that they're not biologically fit for.
We'll be mutually alien to each other, exactly.
We'll be mutual aliens. I love that idea. But if there was one thing about our biology that we should double down on for a prosperous future here on terrestrial Earth, what would you say that is, Lewis?
Yeah, I think our optimism and our problem solving. So clearly we're facing big challenges at the moment with climate change, with global warming. And in a sense, what we're currently living through are the unintended consequences of the solution we found to a previous society challenging problem. So the early 1700s society in Britain and Northern Europe, at least, was effectively running out of energy to heat our homes, to bake bread, to smelt metal out of its ores, to run the fires and furnaces that powered the society we lived in. And the solution we discovered at the time was, well, let's just dig underground and throw the fossilized forests, the coal, into our furnaces to drive ourselves through the Industrial Revolution. And unbeknownst to us at the time, and something that's become very, very apparent now, is that was like releasing, sort of a genie from the lamp as we rubbed it, that it's released carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to very high levels, which has warmed the climate. And so we're now facing the problem created by the previous solution. But we've landed ourselves in this issue because of our high levels of intelligence and problem solving and technological ability. So perhaps I'm being naive, but as a result of that, I'm optimistic that we'll also be able to find the solution to this problem. The trick is to find that solution, but also basically convince everyone to go along with it before time runs out. And I think it's that time dimension that is going to be the bigger challenge. We kind of already know in broad brushstrokes what we ought to be doing and changing our individual lives, but to what extent are we really making those alterations and changes to the extent that we need to? And I think the answer is probably not enough, not yet.
Well, on the optimistic, although perhaps naive note, Lewis, I just want to thank you for being a guest on the Futures podcast.
Thank you, Luke. This has been an absolute blast. Cheers.
Thank you to Lewis for showing us the surprising relationship between our genetics and human culture. You can find out more by purchasing his latest book, Being Human: How Biology Shaped Our World, available now. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode. Or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.